So good afternoon, students. Today we are going to deal with brief introduction to Indian writing in English, in particular with special emphasis on pre-independence era. So when we talk about Indian writing in English, we cannot just start from the British East India Company. Just go into the roots of English into India. So if we talk about the roots of Indian uh, English, the beginnings, we have to go back to Vasco da Gama and his invasion or his establishing three trade routes between Europe and India that happened in the year 1498. So that was the beginning of English into India. And the British East India Company, which was preceded by the French East India Company. So the East India Company, they, in the name of commerce, came and settled in India. And until 1757, they did not have any authority over India. They were just in terms of business. So in 1757, there was a battle of Plassey uh, that took place between British East India Company and the Nawabs of Bengal. As a result of this battle, the Nawabs of Bengal were defeated, and British East India Company started establishing its rule over India. And from 1757 till 1958, it was the rule of British East India Company. And two major changes were observed. One is the rise of Indian Renaissance, which in the word of Sir Aurobindo, Indian Renaissance is more like the Celtic movement that happened in Ireland, an attempt of reawaken national spirit to find the new impulse of self-expression, which leads to reshaping and rebuilding. And the other change that took place is modernization, or in other words, the rise of Indian writing in English. So, with the establishment of British East India Company rule over India, there were certain requirements because they were into a judicial powers and authority. There were certain requirements for the British East India Company. They were in need of people who can translate the things that are happening. They were in need of people who can help the judges in terms of administration. So as a result of which, the study of Sanskrit and Persian languages in India was revived. And a Sanskrit college was established in Banaras by Jonathan Duncan in the year 1792, and Calcutta Madrasa, which was established by Lord Baron Hastings, taught Persian and Arabic, which was again established in 1781. And meanwhile, in the year 1780, India's first newspaper, that is Hickey's Bengal Gazette, was published in India by James Augustus Hickey. Meanwhile, the rise of evangelical movement in England with the ideal of spreading Christianity seemed to be vital for some people, while at the same time, with the establishment of mission schools in England as well as in colonized nations like India, with the assumption of spreading the English language among the natives, which eventually led to the assimilation of Western culture and even more the stability of the empire. Okay, meanwhile, while all these things are happening in England, the Indian reformers, such as very importantly Raja Ram Mohan Roy, advocated for English education, and he was strongly against the establishment of Sanskrit schools. So Raja Ram Mohan Roy, along with educationalists like David Hume and the then Chief Justice of Bengal, Edward Hyde East, they established an association to promote European learning, which served as the first step of establishing the Hindu College in Calcutta, which is right now known as the Presidency College, which was again established in 20th Jan 1817. Moreover, Raja Ram Mohan Roy also established another school in Calcutta, which is known as the Anglo-Hindu school, which was established in 1822. So, with the circumstances strongly favoring the Britishers, Lord Macaulay proposed the minutes upon Indian education in the 2nd of Jan 1835. So, according to Lord Macaulay, it's just to produce a class of peoples, Indians by blood and color, but English in taste, in opinion, in morals, and in intellect. In other words, tame the natives of this country into good English scholars. So there was so according to Macaulay, so so when this particular minutes were launched, India became a testing ground to launch English literature in classrooms, whereas English universities at the same time were uh, advanced in terms of learning a lot about Latin and Greek classics. So when those minutes of Macaulay was launched, there were certain implements, very important implements that were made. One such as English was introduced into the education systems, educational institutions. In other words, the role of Sanskrit and Persian was largely reduced, and in that space, English was introduced. And courts and offices dislodged the usage of Arabic and Sanskrit for which was before used for documentation and communication. So these were the important implements that were made by Macaulay's minutes. So eventually, following Macaulay's minutes, there was something made by Sir Charles Wood, which came to be known as the Wood Dispatch. So some of the implements made by this dispatches, the establishment of universities at Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta, and English being accessible to students, professors, and other government officials. And this English, which was made accessible to the students and professors, which is an offspring of the encounter, or in the words of the colonists, the unholy encounter between the British language and the unwilling Indians, who were then known as the Bapus, came to be known as Bapu English. So this is a brief about Indian writing in English. Now, talking about the development of Indian Renaissance. So the Renaissance in Indian writing has a couple of literary works to start with. Okay, there are like three important phases of Indian writing. This is known as the initial phase, then comes the imitative phase and assimilative phase. So initial phase, it embodies in a lot of social and religious movements. And before that, okay, there was another work that was written in the 17th century, that is the Travels of Dean Muhammad by Sheikh Dean Muhammad, which came out to be the first work in English by an Indian. And some of the other important writers of this particular period is Rajaram Mohan Roy, who was strongly against the usage of Hindu scriptures, was strongly against Sati. He was also a person who was against the role learning method, and he was strongly a person who fought in favor of introducing subjects like maths and science, or in other words, was strongly against the superstitious beliefs that were prevalent at that particular point of time. Another very important writer is Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, was in favor of widow remarriage gambit. And another very important person is Narayana Guru, who was a strong advocate of universalism, who spoke on religious superstitions, was against irrational rituals that were practiced. In particular, okay, or in specific, it was again against the casteist rituals that were prevalent. And another very important writer is Henry Derozio, who spoke in strong favor for nationalism, imparting a spirit of patriotism among the young minds of Indian at that point of time. And another important writer is Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, who wrote the first novel in English, that is Rajmohan's Wife, which came out in the year 1864. So moving on to the next phase, that is imitative phase, which is also known as the first phase of Indian poetry. So since we say that it's an imitative phase, who are these imitations? So the chief source of imitations of the poets of this particular period of time were the popular romantic poets of this 18th century, that is Wordsworth, Keats, Shelley, and Byron. So some of the very famous Indian poets of this particular period is Henry Derozio, who copied the style of Moore and Byron into his works. And okay, again, who strongly imitated the English Romantic movement. So there is a work of Henry Thoreau which is called as Fakir of Jankira, which follows a similar style of Byron's ballads. So there is another poet by the name Kasi Prasad Gauss, who published the Share or the Minstrels and other poets, which is another imitation of Shelley's works. Now we have Michael Madhusudan Dutt, who was a strong imitator of Shakespeare, and his work, that is the slaying of Meghnad, was an imitation of John Milton's Paradise Lost. So Manmohan Ghosh, who wrote love songs and elegies, was another imitator. And the last poet of this particular phase is Torudet, who passed off in a very young age, but we are still remembering Torudet because of the work. Because of her travel throughout the country in her short stay, toward the nations or towards the world, in her short stay, she wrote a couple of works. So one is She Glenned in French Fields, which was published in 1876. Bianca, an unfinished novel. Then, okay, poems like Our Castorna Tree, The Lotus, The Sea of Foliage, which are which are again imitations of English Romantic poets. Now we talk about the next period, that is the assimilative phase. Though again these writers, they took in the idea of romanticism from the 19th century English poets, but with a difference. Though they assimilated the romanticism or the romantic spirit of the 19th century British poets, they also expressed their consciousness of Indian Renaissance, which lay between nationalism and the political changes that were happening at that particular point. Or even more, these poets served as the voice of the contemporary spirit. Some of the very important writers of this particular period were Sri Aurobindo. Sri Aurobindo is known for his spirit of nationalism. Some of his important works include The Life Divine, Essays on the Gita, Foundations of Indian Culture, The Human Cycle, Songs of Mitrilla, which is again a very important lyrical poem, The Tiger and the Deer, and Perseus the Deliverer, which is again written in blank verse. Sarojini Naidu is another very important poet of this particular period, who is not known for her important works like The Golden Threshold, The Bird of Time, The Broken Wing, The Lady of the Lake, Alone, The Bangles and Sellers. All these are some of the important works of Sarojini Naidu. And one of the important writers of India, one of the important writers of the 19th century, and one of the important writers who can't be forgotten when we talk about the Indian writing in English is Rabindranath Tagore. Rabindranath Tagore is known for another reason. So he is the one who wrote the national anthem of India, Sri Lanka, as well as Bangladesh. And for another reason, he's also known for his to won the Nobel Prize for Literature in the year 1913 for his very important collection of poetry, that is Geetanjali. So there is another very important work apart from Geetanjali, that is Rabindra Sangeet, which is a combination of 2,230 songs. So these are the three important phases when we talk about Indian writing in English, in particular about poetry. So what about novel? So the beginning of the 20th century saw the growth of Indian novel. Some of the very important writers of this particular period were Ramesh Chandra Dutt, who was a retired Dawan of Baroda, who wrote his works in Bengali, which were later translated into English. So some of his important works include The Lake of Palms and The Slave Girl of Agra. Another very important writers of this period include T. Ramakrishna, who wrote The Die for Death, Swarna Ghoshal, who wrote The Fatal Garland, Krubadai Satyanathan, who wrote Kama, A Story of Hindu Life, and again Rabindranath Tagore, who was not at all, not a poet, was not a painter, was not a playwright, but he's a combination of everything, who wrote with grace in English as well as in Bengali. Some of his important novels include The Home and the World, that was published in 1919, The Wreck, that was published in 1921, The Gora, which was published in 1923. All these works were written in Bengali, which were later translated into English. So apart from this, When we talk about Indian writing in English, there are three important writers, three important novelists. There is Mulk Raj Anand, R.K. Narayan, and Raja. So we learn about all these writers in the upcoming classes. So thank you for this session, and until we meet again in the next session.